So like I said, this is the penultimate in our Nature Matters series. It's called Threatened, and I'm going to go ahead and have Ranger Jeff introduce himself, and I'm going to mute myself, and let's go. Okay.
Awesome, thanks, Boyd. And also, I'm looking forward to that one with Mike Vorey. Mike is an excellent presenter and speaker, and I'll look forward to that one. So you probably see I have someone here with me. To my right is Ranger Trent. Trent is a park naturalist and has been here, I guess, 3 years now, and he is currently leading the Isle of Marble butterfly effort, which I'm sure many of you know about. So he will be chipping in on a couple of pieces of the presentation, certainly about the IMB, but also about another species we're going to be talking about. So thanks, Boyd, thanks, Floyd, and thanks also to the library and to the park for hosting these. It's been a true pleasure to be able to continue to communicate with folks in the park and those who love the park during these difficult times. I hope they provide something of a respite for those who are unable to come and enjoy the park, even given our limited open facilities. As Boyd mentioned, this is number 4 in a 5-part series focused on resources found in the islands and in the park. And in full disclosure, I am an interpretive ranger, not a naturalist. That's why I brought Trent along tonight. What that means is that I study a topic and then try and give it back to the public in interesting, meaningful, and entertaining ways. I'm not an expert on endangered species, but I put quite a bit of work into trying to bring this topic to you, and I hope you find it interesting, meaningful, and entertaining. Because this topic can be quite technical, Trent is going to be covering also the technical aspects of questions that you might be asking at the end. Some of those I might be able to answer through my research, but again, Trent is the real expert here. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video so it's not as distracting, and let's dig in. So endangered means a species is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, and threatened means it's likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. All that has been defined in the Endangered Species Act of 1973, or you might have heard it called the ESA. The act is administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. They are the ones that maintain the list and also control how people put together programs for interacting with species and helping to maintain species and actually bring them and their ecosystem back to life. All species of plants and animals except pests, insects, are eligible for listing as endangered or threatened. And as we go through this, you'll see that there are other actors as well internationally that have different rules and regulations and interact with these species in a different way. So you'll hear a little bit about that. So what are the criteria for being listed as endangered? These are the 5 primary criteria. A species can meet any one of these and qualify as endangered. It goes through there has to be a formal presentation or nomination of a species, and then it's reviewed by panels of experts and voted on, and a species will be added or not based upon those findings. I will say that while when we hear endangered or threatened, extinctions are very much a natural part of the evolutionary process. But through most of history of life on Earth, biological diversity has been increasing until relatively recently. Periodically, major changes in the conditions on the planet have caused the collapse of living systems, and large percentages of species have gone extinct. I think of the giant meteor strike that hit in the Yucatan, which wiped out many species on the planet, including the dinosaurs. These species will likely never return, and it takes millions of years for life forms to then diversify again. This current extinction crisis, which we're going to talk more about, is unique in the history of the planet in that the loss of biodiversity is occurring very, very rapidly. And the causes of this crisis are activities of a single species. If you haven't guessed, we're that species, human beings. Some scientists believe that the current crisis began when humans and their domestic animals first began to colonize the various parts of the globe. But regardless, we've recognized our role in the extinction process and have tried to varying degrees and various effects to intervene with legislation such as the Environmental Species Act. So what does it mean to be listed? So what are the benefits that accrue or endure with that? So these are some of the primary benefits of being a listed animal. Listing also lends greater recognition to a species status, encourages conservation efforts by agencies, foreign, federal, state, and local, and independent organizations like the Sierra Club and others, and certainly concerned individuals. It's the government's policy that all federal agents will seek to conserve endangered and threatened species and shall use their authorities in furtherance of the purposes of the ESA. So that's a direct quote from the legislation itself laid down by Congress in 1972. How big is the problem? As you can see, it's not a small one. This slide tries to break down the scope of that problem and to give it some perspective on the threat internationally and locally. The species endangered include, get this, 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1/3 of all amphibians on the planet are endangered. The current rate of extinction appears to be hundreds or maybe even thousands of times higher than the background rate of extinction. So by background, we mean the rate of extinction if it were not for human beings. And it's difficult to be precise, obviously, because most endangered species which are disappearing have not yet been identified by scientists. And we'll talk about that a little more in a bit as well. But globally, over 16,000 species endangered, the US 2,600, in the state 30, in the county 9, and in the park there are 2. We'll talk about those 2 as well as many as we can out of the county. I should also mention that the state has a much more expansive list, and if you'd like to email me through Boyd, I can get you that material. It expands on not only the endangered species in the state, but also the threatened species as well. So the ones you see in yellow are the ones that we're going to talk about. So these, this entire list are the endangered species in San Juan County, a lot more than one might expect. And as magnificent as our home is and as conscious as our community is about protecting the environment, we're not immune. Here we see those species whose ranges include the county. As we noted earlier, the state list is much more expansive, but for this presentation, we're only going to focus on the federal listings. And we're not covering orcas only because that's a topic unto itself. That would take much more than an hour, and it's covered in lots of other forums that I'm sure many of you are part of as well, and have heard many of those presentations. So let's look at a few of the endangered species of special interest. Who knew, right? Who knew there was this species called the short-tailed albatross, or Steller's albatross? There you see a few facts about the species. The last one there I'll bring your attention to. Its only remaining breeding population is on a small island in Japan. So, but for that breeding population, this species would already be extinct. I'll also note, it's a bit morbid, but the name Steller actually comes from a German explorer and botanist by the name of George Wilhelm Steller, who was active in the 1700s. I mention him because the first descriptions of this bird were developed by him from skins that he actually took from the animals. I think it's kind of ironic that a nearly extinct bird would bear the name of the person who originally collected its skins. You may ask, okay, and this question comes up all the time. So why is this a big deal? Who cares, right? Who cares if one species goes extinct? There are going to be other species to step in and fill that void, right? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. The answer is other species will step in, but before we jump into other species here in the county that are under threat, let's look at why losing a single species might be problematic. And we're going to come back to this theme of why a single species matters throughout the presentation. So first, who cares about a single species, right? Because a single species is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It's indicative of something much larger happening. If you didn't know, there are roughly 5 million species on the planet. And even with our advanced technologies and hundreds of years of studying these animals, we only have identified only about 1.5 million of those 5 million species on the planet. Given what we know, the extinction problem is likely much greater than we know. Going back to some more statistics, 36% of the roughly 47,000 species that have been assessed worldwide are threatened with extinction. Just soak that in for a second. More than a third of all the species assessed on the planet to this point are threatened with extinction. That represents 21% of all mammals, 30% of all amphibians, 12% of all birds, 28% of reptiles, 37% of freshwater fish, 70% of all plants on the planet are threatened, and 35% of invertebrates. I don't know about you, but that sends a chill down my spine. So the question is not what we know, but how big is the problem really? First species we're going to talk about, you may or may not know that the islands are part of this animal's range, but it's the brown pelican. The brown pelican is no longer endangered, but it's an example of how humans are driving other Earth's inhabitants to extinction. DDT, which I'm sure you all know about, was once hailed as a miracle of agricultural science. Now we know it's been traced to near extinction of many, many species. In 1962, almost single-handedly, a lady by the name of Rachel Carson, I'm sure you've heard about her. If you haven't, read her book, Silent Spring, it's a page-turner. She brought to attention the plight of the bald eagle because of DDT. Like the brown pelican, the eagle is highly susceptible to water pollution. Why? Because it takes most of its food from water where chemicals such as DDT, coal, lead, mercury, uranium, many others eventually end up. Much of what we put into the soil and down our drains ends up in lakes, streams, and eventually into our food chain, things that we eat as well. Chemicals that end up in the water end up in fish. Fish are the primary food source for many wild birds in particular. DDT is almost immediately toxic to birds, but other substances like lead and mercury are consumed by the birds and build up in the animal system over time and eventually kill that animal. Lead comes to mind. So predator bald eagles and golden eagles and other eagles eat prey that might have been shot by a hunter with lead pellets. Once it eats that, it gets into its gullet. It can't digest it. It sticks in its gullet. And over time, that animal will get lead poisoning and die. By the way, the same threat applies to humans. Lead is in almost everything that we eat, including mercury, and in various toxic levels depending on where you live and what kind of foods that you consume. To the degree that we take our food from the water, we too are consuming chemicals that leach into those water systems. So again, back to this question, why care about a single species? because without balance, an ecosystem will absolutely collapse. 90% of a brown pelican's diet is from a forage fish called Manhattan and anchovies, 90%. No pelican equals increasing stocks of both kinds of forage fish. Increasing numbers of forage fish equal increases in predator fish. Increases in predator fish equals a decline in other small fish. Decline of other small fish equals collapse of larger fish populations like mackerel, flounder, tuna, and sharks. Many of those end up on human tables, and many fishing industries are completely dependent on one or some of these animals as part of their livelihood. So, translation, every action has a reaction, sometimes unintended, sometimes unpredictable. Next species we're going to talk about, I love the name, Dolly Varden. Actually, the name comes from a Dickens novel called Barnaby Rudge. Has to do with the spotting, the calico spotting on the female that you see there at the bottom. As you see, dollies are a type of salmonoid and part of the char family, which we find particularly in the Arctic and Alaska. Between 1921 and 1941, Alaska had an official extermination program that paid bounties on Dolly Varden of, get this, 2.5 cents per fishtail. That money was then used to pay for supplies. Even worse, dolly carcasses were used as dog food. The Dolly Varden or the Dolly is a great example of another direct link from humans to near extinction. The threat to dollies is not primarily pesticides or harvesting for some commercial reasons. Dollies were nearly wiped off the planet because they were considered a trash fish and a threat to other salmon populations. Other species have gone extinct in places worldwide because, well, for one reason, they got in the way of human beings. Think of that for just a second. The gray wolf in Yellowstone, mountain lions and grizzlies in California, and the list goes on. Frequently, the only reason a species goes extinct or is threatened is because it's in the way of human beings. Back to this question, why care about a single species? Ecosystem will always try and balance themselves, and every species has a role. As odd as it might sound, in a place like the Puget Sound where salmon are depleted, dollies are an important part of our healthy ecosystem here. Because of their aggression and their feeding habits, they primarily prey on small salmon and their eggs. They help balance the population of many of the species in the Puget Sound. So an unhealthy salmon population, such as here in the Sound, we're left with something of an odd predicament. How do we protect a threatened species, dollies, while trying to increase populations of their prey, Chinook and steelhead, some of which are also protected? This is a prime example of how human behavior has thrown an ecosystem right out our back door, an ecosystem that we live in, that we wake up to every day. Human behavior has thrown that ecosystem into chaos, and it tries to balance itself. So, we've created a predicament for ourselves by interfering with the natural balance of the Puget ecosystem. Number one, we nearly exterminated dollies as a trash fish. Then we overfished Chinook, two very different drivers producing threat to each of these species. Now, as we try to rebalance the Puget ecosystem, we find ourselves trying to play Mother Nature, which I think we should all agree, or hopefully we all agree, is never a good idea and never a good role for humans. For all our intellect and all our cunning, we find ourselves at the mercy of our own lesser selves. So you see the chain of events that produces chaos in the ecosystem in the Puget Sound. Every salmon, every salmonoid in this system has a niche. Salmon spend food energy, initially trying to first eat to maintain, second, to not get eaten, running away, and then only after they've achieved those two can they use food energy to grow and reproduce. So think about it. Take a dolly or take dollies out of the system means that fish upon which dollies prey are under less pressure to avoid being eaten. That sounds like, you know, that might be good, right? We've got more salmon for the orcas. More time to eat and produce means unnatural growth of dolly food fish populations like salmon and steelhead. So we end up with, in a system where there was not pollution, there were not dams on the Skagit and the Fraser River, there were not overfishing for a period of 50 years in the early part of the Puget's history, that might be a good thing, at least for the orcas. But more time to eat and produce means unnatural growth of these smaller salmon, means that we have more salmon that we need that then prey on the smaller food fish in the eelgrass, and we do the exact same thing that we're trying to avoid. We thrust the ecosystem out of balance, and one species in that system begins to dominate and creates imbalance up and down the chain. So the next one we're going to talk about, I'm going to turn over to Ranger Trent. If you haven't seen it, that we do have some on the island, non-cultivated, called golden paintbrush. So I'm going to let Ranger Trent take this one.
Yeah, so golden paintbrush is an endangered plant in the Northwest, once much more abundant than it is now. There's some populations in Washington, and I believe at least one population in Oregon. It's a hemiparasitic plant, and that's a pretty unique feature to have. Other paintbrushes are like this as well, where they don't necessarily need other plants to survive, but what they do is they'll tap into the roots of some of the plants around them. They can't do it to just any plant, but particular species. They'll derive nutrients from those roots. And it's not necessarily needed for them to survive, but they can flourish much more throughout the prairies if they can do that. And so one possibility for their decline, I mean, obviously, is just the overall reduction in Northwest prairies. I think they've been reduced down to about 3% or so of their original, what was originally prairie in the Northwest.
And agriculture.
Yeah, and agriculture. Yeah, agriculture and development has reduced those prairies, which has reduced golden paintbrush habitat, as well as plants for golden paintbrush to tap into. And in the islands here, there's only one population that I know of in the park, actually, and I was actually extirpated for some time and replanted over a series of years. And we've had some success replanting that with Romer's fescue and using that as the golden paintbrush's host plant. And so an interesting kind of dynamic with the golden paintbrush is the tailored checker spot butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly, also uses the golden paintbrush as its host plant. And so we have multiple layers of some level of dependency here, where the golden paintbrush relies on native plants in the prairie to flourish, to tap into their roots. And then the Taylor's checker spot butterfly utilizes the golden paintbrush as a host plant for its larvae. And so you can imagine these kind of, when one species is impacted, this will have impacts on the other species. And so this can, you know, it's somewhat of an example of kind of a trophic cascade, where if the prairie is reduced, there's fewer plants for the golden paintbrush to tap into. Fewer golden paintbrushes will impact the Taylor's checker spots, and you know, could potentially make them extinct, or they'll have to adapt and utilize. They do use some other plants as host plants, but they'll have to use more of those or find new plants. And so there's just an interesting and kind of fragile level of dependency here, where one level is impacted and that can have a big effect that kind of ripples throughout the whole ecosystem.
And I guess a larger point to, thanks Trent, that was awesome. Yeah. A larger point to make about this is, you know, people ask, well, why don't the Taylor checker spot just find a different plant? These species have evolved over millions of years to be very focused on how they reproduce and how they survive. And they haven't come about these characteristics or these survival techniques at random. For some reason, in the biologic history of the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, it's zoned in on this one plant, and it's most successful with that plant. Once that plant is taken out of the ecosystem, the butterfly is kind of like, so I guess a good paradigm would be, you know, my kids used to love pizza. They would only eat pizza and macaroni and cheese. You probably had children like that as well. So if I took pizza and macaroni and cheese out of my kids' diet, you know, they would whine for a while, and eventually they'd go to something else. The checker spot doesn't have parents hanging around to point them to a different food source. So they're thrown into complete confusion. One of two things will happen, but it'll happen over millennia in all likelihood. Either that butterfly will go extinct very quickly when the paintbrush is gone, or a few will survive and they will find a different plant to lay their eggs on and to interact with. But that evolution will take long periods of time. And that evolution is probably also highly dependent on humans staying out of the way, which we're not very good at doing. Next species we're going to talk about, you may not have seen, but you've probably seen on National Geographic and elsewhere, but we are in the range of the leatherback sea turtle, also called the lute. The leatherback is a holdover from the Cretaceous period. So it's existed in relatively the same form for some 110 million years. Lutes have no teeth. Instead, they've got points on their on the upper lip, and they have backward spines in their throats that prevent food from escaping once they catch it. That one adaptation, that the spines in the throat, is problematic, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. Pacific leatherbacks will migrate about 6,000 miles across the Pacific from their nesting sites in Indonesia for one reason, and that's to eat jellyfish off the coast of California. So one cause for their endangered status is plastic bags floating in the ocean. You may know that a couple of years ago, the state of California outlawed plastic bags from supermarkets and elsewhere. And that was in direct response to biologists telling the politicians and the public domain that this was going to drive this particular animal to extinction. So it's a very specific reason, right? So Pacific leatherback sea turtles mistake these plastic bags for jellyfish, and an estimated 1/3 of adults have ingested plastic. And this stuff is incredibly difficult for them to regurgitate. Why? Because of those backward spines in their throat. Primary threats, again, are because humans like to eat them, and they like to eat their eggs. The primary threat is in their Asian breeding grounds, where their eggs are harvested for food, and in the Caribbean, where their eggs are considered an aphrodisiac, although there's no scientific evidence to confirm that. So one reason to care about this species, if for no other reason, is that it survived for 110 million years until human beings came along. What might that say about the human species if it perishes because of us? Maybe more important is that they are also a major jellyfish predator, which helps keep populations of jellyfish in check. This is important to humans. Why? Because jellyfish diets consist largely of larval fish, the adults of which are commercially fished by humans. So fewer leatherbacks equals more jellyfish equals fewer commercial fish for human beings. Next, we're going to go back to Trent. He's going to talk about his favorite species. I think if he could, he would probably have some of these as pets at home, but that's prohibited by park regulations. So tell us something about the IMB that we don't know, Trent.
Well, the alley marble butterfly gets a lot of attention at the park, and probably all or may or may not have heard that it was thought to be extinct for 90 years. And prior to its supposed extinction, it was only observed on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, and the last observation was in 1908 on Gabriola Island, and it was rediscovered on San Juan and Lopez Islands in 1998. And that's not to say that it wasn't here before, but it was most likely just not documented down here prior to that. But since its rediscovery in 1998, a lot of surveys were done throughout the entire kind of Western Washington, Southern BC area to see where these butterflies were. And there were a few populations found on San Juan Island and one population on Lopez. And since then, the population has been further reduced to now they're pretty much only at American Camp. They do occasionally fly outside the park boundaries, and last year I think there was at least one egg observed outside the park boundaries, so that was exciting, but a much more limited range than they used to have. And so they primarily use 3 different mustard plants as their host plants, so the plants that they lay their eggs on and that their caterpillars eat as they grow. These are field mustard, which is dominant in the prairies, tumble mustard, which is typical in the dune ecosystem, and then Menzies pepperweed or Virginia pepperweed, which is down in the lagoons. And the interesting aspect of this, I think this is, I don't know, one of the most fascinating things to me is that 2 of these host plants are actually non-native. The field mustard and the tumble mustard are non-native plants. And I think it's just, I don't know, such an unusual kind of thing, especially for national parks, and we usually view non-native plants as bad, native plants as good. And the reality is it's more complicated than that. And the island marbles seem to do best on the tumble mustard, and probably second to that, the field mustard, and the pepperweed really seems to be, you know, third, kind of like a third preference, or at least third most of what they're active on in the park. And so, I don't know, I think that's just kind of an interesting take on endangered. Before we had an endangered butterfly relying on an endangered plant, and now we've got an endangered butterfly relying on non-native plants.
It's a strange relationship.
So in terms of protection for the island marbles, after their rediscovery in 1998, there's a conservation agreement signed in 2006 between the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service to protect and improve our habitat. And so that was, you know, intended to prevent them from going extinct, and then their population numbers seemed to continue reducing. And so in 2013, the park started doing captive rearing. And so this has been a really fun project where every year we collect eggs from the wild, raise them as caterpillars in the lab, and then release them as adult butterflies to fly around and mate with each other and lay more eggs the following spring. And actually this year, they were finally officially listed under the Endangered Species Act. So,
Yay.
yeah, so hopefully that means more protection for the island marbles. So what are some of the primary threats to island marbles? And I guess, you know, kind of a thought with this is, how did they get into this situation in the first place? And I would say a current and historic threat would be general habitat loss. And historically, you know, going back to the reduction of prairies, they rely on prairie plants. And so with development and agriculture and things like that, reducing prairies in the Northwest, this reduced their habitat, reduced their population size.
So that under primary threats, Trent, I look at that first bullet and I'm drawn to it. Habitat loss from invasive species. So the primary species taking away island marble butterfly habitat is an invasive species called human beings, right?
Right, yeah, I would say that's probably the case, yeah. And that's kind of, I think, why the island marbles are probably have been limited the last decade or so to pretty much American Camp, is because it's a park and it's protected. There hasn't really been development down there compared to the other sites on Lopez or San Juan, where there have been development that, you know, in Vancouver and Gabriola and the Gulf Islands throughout history, where they've had habitat and that's all been developed or farmed or various other things. And so since the park is now kind of like a reservoir for them, since it's not being developed, a current big threat is habitat loss from invasive species. So these can be certain invasive plants, thistles, for example, and non-native grasses and such that take over the prairie and reduce the native plants. And I think that's, again, considering that their host plant is a non-native plant, I think that's another just really fascinating contrast, because we have kind of non-native species that are threatening an endangered species that's reliant on a different non-native species. So it's kind of like non-native species versus non-native species out there, and that's why we encourage the non-native mustards, because they use them as host plants. And in other parts of the world, other parks I've worked at, I mean, I've done control on tumble mustard where it's become invasive, but out here, these plants do really well after disturbance. So like when the new, I think when the road was moved some years ago down at Cattle Point, there was a flush of tumble mustard after that because of all the disturbance. And so, that disturbance has happened historically through the prairie, and since it's a protected park now, we're putting a lot of effort into bringing out more of these host plant or non-native mustards, which are their host plants, and still kind of, even they're not taking off. They're definitely not invading the prairies. We're trying to do what we can to have more of them to save the island marbles.
I guess the point to be to be made there is, as you said earlier, these are really complex interactions, and even without the intervention of human beings, these would be very complex interactions. We've just made it worse so. And here we are in a situation where we're relying on non-natives to keep an endangered species alive. Doesn't seem like the best of all worlds. Thanks, Trent.
Yeah.
So, number 4, why care about a single species? If I were going to point to one, this is probably the best reason. There is a single species under threat which has a direct link to human civilization. The species which we're going to talk about meets all the criteria for an endangered species that we listed earlier, those being overutilization, disease or predation, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, or other natural or man-made factors affecting its survival. What is that species? Human beings. Are we under threat? Let's talk a little bit about that. So, humans, a predatory animal which instead of consuming only what it needs, tends to consume far in excess of its biological needs. Perhaps we can agree that in this case, a single species does matter. So Homo sapiens, in terms of their ability to dominate their environment, are clearly the most successful species in written or unwritten history. And yet, even with such incredible capabilities, success, and promise, our species is under threat, not from outside influences, but from direct threats of our own making. So what are some of those threats? Upwards of 50% of this species range has come under threat of near-term extinction within the next 50 years due to economic growth and its natural collapse, untempered development, severe resource misallocation, air, water pollution, ecosystem degradation, energy scarcity, climate change, potential nuclear war, and a variety of interrelated factors. Let's look at those in a little more detail. So if we were looking at the 5 criteria for listing a species, let's see if human beings meet these criteria. Number 1, the present or threatened destruction of habitat, utilization of a species or its habitat for commercial recreational purposes. So, pollution has increased tenfold since 1980. Humans have destroyed 1/10 of the Earth's wilderness in the last 25 years. Trophic cascade affects humans too. We're more than 75% of the global food crop, including fruits and vegetables, coffee and cocoa, are reliant on animal pollination and therefore are at risk from plummeting insect populations. A few facts supportive number 1 and number 2. Number 3, disease and predation. So if I look at this at first glance, this is good news, right? Life expectancy is going up, even in the most impoverished places on the planet. But think more broadly. More people equals more strain on our species and accelerating strain on all species. Remember, trophic cascade, environmental impacts flow up through an ecosystem and tend to be persistent. So, lack of disease and lack of predation on the human species is actually a huge threat to the human species. So, we can actually modify the criteria to include the lack of disease and predation. I'd like you to lean forward and take in what I'm about to tell you, because this fact is at the heart of the threats to human beings. From the advent of modern human species through 300,000 years until year zero, that's 200, excuse me, 2000, up until the year zero, 2020 years ago, the population of the planet went from 1 to approximately 200 million. So in roughly 300,000 years, it went from 1 to 200 million. What that means is that in my lifetime, world population has increased from 2.9 billion the year I was born to 7.7 billion at the end of last year. By the time I reach 100 years old, yes, an optimistic projection, I admit, world population is projected to be 10.1 billion people. Now, I leave the obvious conclusion to you, but I do ask this question. Based on our history as a species, what we know about ourselves, can we as a species affect our environment enough to allow that environment to sustain this number of people and that growth? And if so, for how long? I will say that a dire future is not inevitable. This is not a foregone conclusion. But surviving that future requires dramatic, monumental, life-altering, and civilization-altering change. Lastly, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. We've done a really great job in this area, but is it enough? And is it too late? In the US, regulation of how we interact with our environment has steadily and dramatically increased over time. This parallels regulation in other advanced social systems worldwide. And yet globally, the environment continues to react negatively. Why? For lots of reasons, obviously, but ultimately it comes down to our species' willingness to apply ourselves to all the problems we've created, not just the easy ones, relatively easy ones like pollution. So the question now is, has the extent of the problems such as climate change outpaced our ability to address them in time to reverse or at least mediate the impacts? Climate change, unlike pollution, may not be reversible. Does this leave our species as endangered? I don't know. You come to your own conclusions. What I do know is that it is too big a problem for me to focus on. What I can focus on is my contribution to the problem and how I live my life. And I can use my voice to speak up, and I'm in the advantageous position of being in a job that allows me the opportunity to, in some small way, contribute to solutions. I leave all of us with this question. What are we doing in whatever ways possible to affect solutions? So, in conclusion, I think Chief Seattle got it right. And he had the disadvantage of not being able to look forward in history. But he knew from thousands of years of Native American history that we're not alone. We're not alone on this planet. Everything we do as a species, everything that our species on the planet does, has some impact on other species and the ecosystems it's a part of. We simply can't escape the cascade of effect that our actions have on our environment. And there's good reason to look at this as a glass half full. We're doing lots of things right. And as a species, we're moving in some right directions in some areas. We should be encouraged by the work many of you are doing in the islands to protect and preserve the beautiful and complex life that we have here. But just as a doctor cautions about dieting, you can't make short-term changes and expect long-term results. We have to find ways for our species to exist differently and to interact with our environment and with other species in new and in different ways. If we've learned nothing else from seeing our impact on the environment, locally and globally, it's that we have been doing what we have been doing to this point has not worked. and that these problems will not go away and will only get worse. But most important, I leave you with this: we can change things, we can do things differently, and each of us has an impact. Each of us can make a difference. With that, I thank you, and back over to Boyd.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. That was great. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to go ahead and start with questions. And I'll just repeat for people who kind of came in later. You can ask questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand, and hopefully I will see you. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question from Rebecca Moore. What do you think about plans to eradicate mosquitoes, Jeff?
Well, it depends. As a picnicker or as a ranger? If I'm talking about being a picnicker down at South Beach or someplace else on the island, I'm probably I'd probably put a thumbs up. But as a ranger and somebody that cares about the planet, mosquitoes are not a pest. We once considered the Dolly Varden a pest, and look at the predicament we're in because of it. Yes, mosquitoes carry lots of terrible diseases and have caused lots of misery throughout human history, but they perform a highly necessary function. One asks, well, what's a necessary function for malaria and all the disease that mosquitoes carry in the tropics? As harsh as it might sound, there are lots of systems worldwide that depend on disease to keep the population down. That's a horrible, horrible thing to contemplate, that we don't get rid of mosquitoes because we want to control the population. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying is that they perform a necessary function as in the ecosystem, and to take them out with insecticides and with pesticides seems, going back to unintended consequences, not knowing what the repercussions of that are. I have to assume that Mother Nature knew what she was doing when she put mosquitoes into almost every environment on the planet. And I'm not willing to say she's wrong and push for eradication of mosquitoes. My personal view.
Thank you. I'm not actually seeing anything else right now. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question, Jeff. So you talk about, the impact of human beings, and I thought you said that we're the only species that really kind of overreaches in regard to what we require or what we eat. And I would contend with that. I'm certainly aware of certain species that actually kill beyond what they need in terms of eating. But how would you compare, for instance, a beaver that basically modifies a riverine environment radically to some human actions? And I realize this may be a quantity versus quality question.
Yeah, so those are great questions. And there are lots of species that kill more than they consume. Do they do it to the extent that human beings do? No. In America alone, we have more than 30% food waste. So we're creating, not only does our agriculture, do we create lots of problems in the way we raise crops, we create so much that we throw a great percentage of it away. The second part of the question, say that again, Boyd.
Is how do you compare, for instance, a beaver's impact on a riverine environment where basically through its modification, it actually probably exterminates some species in the area to human action?
Yeah, I'm not sure it actually exterminates the species. And I'm going to rely on Trent on that one. Here's what I would say: we do the exact same thing. We take trees out of the environment and put them through mills and then build houses out of them. I don't know how that's any different than the beaver, cutting them down and leaving them in place so that they can have a home. Do you have a view on this, Trent?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think that, the controversy about dams and logging and that kind of thing, it's something every time I see a beaver munching down some trees, I kind of think the same thing. But I guess nature's had time to adapt to beavers, and the amount of trees that they're taking down is a lot less than the huge dams that we've built, and the impact, and the big clear cuts. And I would say the impact from humans is much larger. And so, sure, if you gave it enough time, nature would also adapt to what we do, the same way it's adjusted to what beavers have done. But at the same time, how many species are going to go extinct in that great amount of time? How differently are humans? What kind of technologies are we going to invent that nature just isn't going to have time to adapt to before so many extinctions and impacts happen?
And I think those beaver those beaver ponds, create habitat for lots of other species that may not come in there otherwise. Sure, we do that as well. Every time we build a skyscraper, it's a home for lots of pigeons and in some cases peregrine falcons. But it seems to me that a beaver dam and a beaver pond are much more in keeping with the ecosystem than a skyscraper is.
Okay, thank you. So I do have a question from Phil Green. Could you talk about the effects of deer and rabbits on golden paintbrush?
Yeah, that's a Trent question for sure.
That is a good question. I can't say specifically. I mean, deer, as far as I know, at least don't eat golden paintbrush. Rabbits, honestly, I don't know if they eat golden paintbrush either. I kind of doubt it. But both of them will certainly eat plants that golden paintbrush uses to tap into its roots and hemiparasitize. And so I guess I would argue that deer and rabbits have an impact on golden paintbrush by reducing the plants that the golden paintbrush kind of depends on, or at least utilizes to flourish. And so subsequently, the more deer and the more rabbits, the more pressure there is on golden paintbrush, and the less there ends up being.
So to extrapolate on that just a bit, had humans not interfered with the prairie ecosystems throughout North America, paintbrush wouldn't be under threat and wouldn't be under such stress, and those questions would be, they wouldn't be problematic because there would be enough paintbrush to sustain whatever the deer and the rabbits took. So we've created this problem by through agriculture and taking away habitat for the golden paintbrush. So now we have a problem of our own making, in that yes, deer and rabbit may very well, apparently we don't know for sure, may very well be consuming golden paintbrush, but it wouldn't be a problem but for there not being enough habitat for the golden paintbrush caused by humans.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe if you don't mind, I'll ask one more question.
Sure.
So it seems to me that, and maybe this is way too philosophical and thinking it out too much, but it strikes me that one of our ways we survive as a species is by thinking ahead, thinking about the future and planning. And in fact, a lot of your response and what you've talked about in terms of the Park Service response to endangered or threatened species is that thinking ahead and intervening, if you will, for the good, we hope. But I'm wondering if that doesn't get into a kind of a vicious circle or a vicious action-reaction cycle.
I think it does, Boyd. I think you're absolutely right. And it's, again, unintended consequence. And for every action, there's a reaction. It may not necessarily be equal and opposite, but every time we fiddle with an ecosystem, intentionally or not, it has an impact up and or down the food chain or in that troposphere. So it is a very philosophical question. Do we try and do something about it, or do we leave nature to her own devices to try and make these corrections? You know, I have my personal view. You can probably guess what that is. I think these species are worth saving. I think that it's back to the kind of the philosophical point I made earlier about the leatherback turtle. You know, it's been here for 110 million years. What does that say about our species, that we're driving other species off the planet at alarming rates? If we know that we're doing that and we don't do anything about it, what does that say about us as a species? Again, I pose the question. I have my own answer for that, but I'd pose that to other people. You know, is the natural consequence of human evolution on the planet that other species go extinct, and is that what Mother Nature might have intended, or are we victims of our own success? There's lots of philosophy bound up in that question. It's a great one.
Thank you. So I have a question from Dante, and that is, where is the island marble butterfly found in the park?
We have to be kind of careful on that one, right? So, and I know Trent will be cautious on this as well, because once we start pointing things out, it becomes like a magnet. So that's why we don't talk about archaeology in the park, right? Although there's incredible amounts of archaeology in the park, pre-contact and post-contact. But when we point things out, people tend to want to go look. You know, we're a curious species. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Trent.
Yeah, those are kind of spread all throughout the American camp area, which I guess really the whole thing. I mean, you won't see them inside like the forest, but I mean, they're out on the prairie, they're out in the dunes, they're out around the lagoons. So yeah, honestly, I guess if you are, you know, interested in seeing any, the timing is kind of the more.
So what is good time here? Yeah, what is a good time here? And I know why Dante's asking, because he's got a really incredible camera and a set of lenses, but what is the best time of the year to see them?
Yeah, so the adults late April or early May, and they'll fly until about May to late June or so. I think we've seen them once or twice in July, maybe, but typically May and June times that you'll see them flying around. And you know, honestly, they're very easy to confuse with other white butterflies. I mean, even doing surveys for years and you know, working with them up close, like there are many times when I, you know, without binoculars and sometimes without the butterflies, you know, stopping its flight, it's so easy to confuse with cabbage whites or pine whites. So it can be easy to mix up, because from a distance they all just kind of look like small white butterflies flying around. But yeah, so May or June's the best time, and I mean, really, kind of anywhere around the whole of American camp, you can order them.
Now, Dante, the great answer, you know, if we did this presentation again in 5 years, that I would hope we would say is, you know, you can find them any place at American camp, and some places maybe in the middle of the island, and you know, we've seen a couple up north of the island. I mean, that would be true success. One of the things that Trent and I were talking about before we came online, and one of the questions we expected, you know, might get answered, is, you know, what's the prognosis for the island marble? So we've been at this since, what, 2006, is that right?
For rearing?
Yeah, no, just for helping them. Okay, so essentially for 14 years we've been on this project. I would remind you that the bald eagle was first not listed as endangered, but a species listed by the federal government as a species of concern in 1940. And it took until 2005, I think it was, to be taken off the endangered species list. So 65 years trying to solve that problem of intervening and bringing the bald eagles back from almost extinction down to something like 25,000 nesting pairs in all of North America. And by the end of this year, something like 250,000 nesting pairs in the lower 48. So while we're in the maintenance mode, I think is what you told me, right? Trent, expand on this. We're in maintenance mode with the island marble. At some point in time, what we're hoping to is really reach critical mass with new habitat and control mechanisms in the rearing project to try and get them on the upswing. But we may be in a 65-year project. I mean, who knows?
And I will add, we had Jenny Schrum talking about the island marble. It was either a year ago or a year before that, and she mentioned at the time that there were only 129 individuals that they were aware of, which was just staggering to me in terms of an insect. So,
do you have some updates on that, Trent, as far as numbers go?
Collected over 200 this year, so they're at least that high. And for like for the wild population, we do surveys every year, and I'm not exactly sure how that translates into like overall population, but
certainly higher than 125.
Yeah, it's presumed to be less than 500 total, but in the hundreds range, we would think so. And yeah, for insects, it's definitely a small number, and this time of year they're all in their chrysalis, and year by year, like they're just kind of on an annual cycle. They live for about a year total or so, and so that can really vary a lot, I guess, by year to year, but that's what we think is kind of in the hundreds range.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, everything on the island is cyclical in that way. So last year, almost no blackberries, right? So this year, huge blackberry population, but they seem to be all really small. The rabbits last year, they were everywhere, along with the red foxes in the prairie. This year, almost no rabbits, and of course the foxes have moved on as well. So Mother Nature is very cyclical. Hopefully we'll reach that cycle with the IMB where, again, we can say it's all over the island, and maybe on some of the other islands as well.
Great. So another question from Dante, did Bob and Bertha have any chicks this year?
Great question. We don't think so. Trent watched them more closely than I did. What did you see, Trent?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, whether or not they so they didn't seem disturbed by the construction, which was really in going in earnest during breeding time, February and March. So we don't think we had anything to do with that. The year before last, as you know, Dante, they had two and neither survived. But last year, boy, weren't we fortunate with two beautiful chicks, and they both fledged. So very cyclical.
Well, good. I'm not, unless somebody's desperately waving or hopefully unmuting themselves and shouting at me. I'm not seeing any more questions. So I'm going to thank you guys so much. Oh, wait, sorry. Phil comes in here. Notice the English Camp Osprey weren't successful too.
Yeah, that was really disappointed. I kept an eye on them as well. I saw them on the nest early in the season, but I didn't see any chicks, and because there were no chicks, I think the ospreys abandoned the nest. You may have seen them on the nest. I haven't seen them on the nest in a couple of months now, so I have to say, yeah, no success there either.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Jeff and Trent, this has really been great, and I really appreciate all the questions. And like I said, I am recording this so for those of you who came in late, if you missed parts of it, we'll hopefully get it up to our library website within a week or so. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Boyd. Thanks, Floyd. These